So, yeah, I talked about how Australian English is incredibly homogeneous. There's very little variations, but obviously it still does have variations. So, variations you can find within geography. So, with different regions, you're still going to hear different styles of accents, different cultures, and different cultures. That's it. I don't know why there were three hours. Why it looks like there were three. Would be 3 hours. Okay, so starting with variations in Australian English, like we're gonna start with the geographical variations, and phonologically it's pretty minimal, but a big difference you hear is uh, sort of the difference in pronunciation of like an like an A sound, right? So celery, celery, Melbourne, Melbourne, telly, telly, right? You'll hear that fairly often. Another big difference is the sound, and this is most apparent within Adelaide. For example, the word dance, right? Uh, you'd often hear more so people who uh, in Adelaide say dance rather than dance. So this IPA here is displaying the sound, so the more open rather than right? So uh, so for example, uh, castle, castle would be said 40% in Hobart, 70% in Melbourne, as opposed to only 14% in Adelaide. Um, while castle is spoken more so in Adelaide. Oh yeah, yeah, dance and dance here is really apparent. So dance, most of the nation says dance, while Adelaide actually says dance because only 14% of the Adelaide population say the sound rather than the sound. Um, I feel like these a lot of 14s I'm seeing. I feel like these 14% are like the same exact people, just saying the same thing. Fair enough. Yep. Okay. There's generally also quite minimal lexical variation around Australia, but uh, again, it's a homogeneous like accent throughout Australia. But one kind of variation you'll see is that this thing um, would be called like this potato cake can be called a potato scallop or a fritter or a hash brown in different areas of Australia. So yeah, I probably called this a hash brown, but it's kind of different. Yeah, could be a potato cake. Personally, it's a hash brown for me, but um, so as you can see from the map, there's a significant divide, but for this example, there is an apparent divide between um, regions in terms of whether they call it a potato cake or a potato scallop in this case, right? Um, Not very common in terms of examples that we have for this. So yeah. Yeah, so evidence is not apparent for variations that much in grammar and pronunciation. There's stronger evidence in vocab, such as this, but again, there's not that much. Okay, we can now move on. to cultural variation um, within Australian English. So this is where we kind of talk about how different ethnic groups and cultural groups um, actually has their own dialects. Uh, as I said, ethnolects earlier, and how that impacts their language and such and such. So variation due to culture and ethnicity is way more apparent than geographical variation. So if we're thinking about identity, I think one of the most important things that comes into people's minds is our ethnicity, right? Not just because, well, it is profound, quite apparent to who we are, and it doesn't, change throughout our lives. Um, who we are, like, it is also because Australian society is quite multicultural, and so that sense of identity is found within particularly ethnicity and where you came from, to vary yourselves from others being a multicultural nation. Yep. So important marker of ethnic group. What ethnolex for ethnolex? Okay. So um, so culturally, you're going to see uh variations such as the Aboriginal Australian accent. So I want to make one thing very clear: the Aboriginal Australian accent is not an ethnolect compared to other ethnolects because um, Australian, I guess Aboriginal Australian English is kind of just. I'm not. I'll be honest. I'm not exactly sure. I don't remember the reasoning behind it. I'm sure there's content covering that specifically, but it is not considered on its own an ethnolect. An ethnolect refers to those who are from varying cultures that are not like originally Australian, I guess. Um, Perhaps that's the reasoning why. But uh, other than that, um, the variations kind of work the same way as with an ethnolect. So uh, we've got this conversation article here about how Aboriginal English varies, and it's an interesting read. There's a lot of ways that Aboriginal Australian English varies from just standard Australian English, and one of the ways is with its lexicology or even its morphology uh, the term una to uh, as like sort of like a in this case sort of like a discourse particle, I guess, to end the sentence. Yeah. Okay. So I talked earlier about how Australia is quite multicultural, and that is part of the Australian identity. So when you talk about ethnolex and such, you can refer to how, yes, this is representing the Australian identity of multiculturalism uh, and egalitarianism and so on, being very carefree, being accepting of other people's ways of and cultures. So because of that multiculturalism, we see like the cultural borrowings between uh, ethnolex and also just slang beginning to flourish. We see the words halal uh, being very common in Australian dictionary and Australian English. For example, a HSB, a distinctly Australian invention that is an initialism of a halal snack pack. So that is a borrowing of an Arabic word. So, and also Habibi is just used as a term of endearment, more commonly nowadays. All right. So, how can ethnolex actually display uh, social in groups? I think it's most apparent with terms of endearment, such as use, or I'm not exactly sure, but terms of endearment, particularly with certain ethnolex, really highlights a sense of strong cultural identity and strong, that strong in-group membership if used with uh, people of the same ethnic group, right? And that's what you see here in this example, kind of just protecting that culture by continuing the use of ethnolect. Yep. So uh, how we use language is reflective of ourselves. It is important to see ourselves within our language, our slangs. Uh, it our language is what we use to make us feel accepted to not only ourselves but also part of Australian identity. And that kind of notion is this quote is genuinely beautiful. I like really good, not beautiful as in like um I guess like profound, but it's actually quite useful in terms of when I think about the types of exams or essays that I used to write. Most of my essays that I wrote were kind of about how language impacts our culture, how language impacts our thinking and our attitudes and our values. And I guess this quote really embodies that quite well.